The Arizona Territory in 1890 was less a place and more a test of endurance. The sun baked the red earth until it cracked. The air stung with dust, and survival felt more like stubbornness than triumph. Tucked away in this harsh landscape, some 30 miles from Flagstaff, lay the Mormon settlement of Cedar Ridge, a small collection of buildings, huddled together like secrets whispered into the wind. It was here that Ezekiel Woolley claimed the Lord had spoken to him. The Woolley compound stood weathered against the elements' wooden slats, creaked with every gust, and the dry scent of sagebrush drifted through the chapel windows. Ezekiel stood before his family that autumn evening, framed by the flickering light of oil lamps. He was tall and lean, his gray eyes sharp and piercing. His beard, streaked prematurely white, gave him a solemn biblical presence. To those gathered his wives, children, and a few loyal neighbors, he appeared more prophet than man. "The Lord has spoken to me," he said, his voice low but commanding. "The church in Salt Lake has forsaken the true path. They've bent their knees to Gentiles and politicians. But we will not. We are the remnant. We are chosen." His 3 wives sat quietly in the front row. Sarah, the first and legal wife, sat with her back straight but eyes weary. She was 40 now and had borne Ezekiel 8 children over the years. The glow that once lit her features had faded beneath layers of obedience and unspoken sorrow. Beside her sat Rebecca, young and cautious, barely 25. And then Martha, not yet 20, the newest to join the household and still learning her place in its intricate, silent hierarchy. Behind them, the children filled the pews, 14 in all. The eldest, Joshua, was 23, stoic and watchful. He carried the quiet weight of expectation. The youngest, little Mary, was just 7, still untouched by the anxiety that hung like smoke in the air. The older ones understood that something had shifted in their father's tone. The younger ones only squirmed in the silence that followed. Then Thomas Hartwell, one of the few men in the settlement not related by blood or marriage to Ezekiel, broke the tension. "Brother Woolley," he said, his voice careful, "what is it the Lord revealed?" Ezekiel turned his gaze toward him slowly. "The principle of celestial marriage," he began, "extends beyond what the church ever dared to teach. There are deeper truths, sacred rituals, ordinances required to protect the purity of our souls." A chill swept over Sarah like the wind. Outside, but it didn't come from the desert air. Her mind reached back across the years to when she first met Ezekiel, a young missionary then, filled with conviction but tender in spirit. That man was gone. In his place stood someone colder, someone dangerous. Joshua, ever the diplomat, kept his tone neutral. "What sort of ordinances, Father?" Ezekiel smiled, but there was no joy in it. "All in due time, my son. For now, know this, we have been called to a greater purpose. We must preserve the true gospel, whatever the cost." That night, as the others dispersed, Sarah lingered. In the chapel, she moved slowly, dousing the lanterns, pretending it was routine. In truth, she just needed a moment alone. Her thoughts swirled like dust devils. She had never feared Ezekiel. Not truly. Not until now. "Mother?" She turned to see Elizabeth standing in the doorway, her green eyes wide, her auburn hair glowing in the lamplight. At 16, Elizabeth looked uncannily like Sarah had at that age, before the desert, before the weariness. "Yes, my dear? Is Father ... all right? He seems different lately, more intense." Sarah hesitated. In this household, to question Ezekiel's authority was to tread on dangerous ground. "Your father bears a heavy burden," she said carefully. "These are trying times." But even as she spoke, her mind drifted back to a conversation she'd overheard a few nights ago. Ezekiel had met privately with Thomas and 2 other men from neighboring homesteads, Men who, like him, rejected the church's softened stance on plural marriage. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. She was returning. From the root cellar, when she'd caught their hushed voices through the window, the young ones must be prepared. Ezekiel had said, "Purity demands it. Ritual is the only way to shield them from corruption." How young? Thomas had asked, his voice uncertain. 12, 13, Ezekiel had answered. When they reach the age of spiritual awakening, the Lord will show us the time. Sarah had pressed closer to the door, breath caught in her throat. She heard no more. But it was enough. Now, standing in the chapel beside her daughter, Sarah felt that memory return like a lead weight in her chest. "You look pale," Elizabeth said softly. Sarah forced a smile. "Just tired, sweetheart. Come help me with the lamps. Then we'll both get some rest." Together they moved through the room, silent but close. And as they worked, Sarah made a quiet vow. She would watch. She would wait. And if her fears became reality, she would act. She didn't know how. She only knew she had to. Because love for a child could be more powerful than any scripture, any prophet, any man who claimed to speak for God. Across the compound, Ezekiel sat at his desk, scratching a new entry into his leather-bound journal. "The Lord has revealed to me the mysteries of celestial purification. The children must be prepared. Tomorrow, the selection begins. The time for hesitation is over." He set down his pen, folded the journal shut, and locked it away, unaware that outside the window, Joshua stood in the shadows, his breath fogging the glass, his eyes fixed on his father's every move. 3 weeks had slipped by since Ezekiel's proclamation, and the Woolley compound had begun to feel different. The silence was heavier, the air thicker. What once had been a tense but orderly rhythm of chores and prayers was now an undercurrent of watchfulness, like something was creeping just beneath the surface. Ezekiel had taken to spending long hours in his study, and when he wasn't there, he was conducting private spiritual assessments with the children. One by one, they were summoned. Some sessions lasted a half hour, others stretched beyond 2. And when the children emerged, their eyes were downcast, their faces pale. Not a single one would say what had happened behind that heavy wooden door. From the barn's shadow, Joshua watched it all unfold. He leaned against the rough siding, arms crossed, eyes locked on the courtyard. Mary ran across it barefoot, her laughter echoing through the dust and sun. At just 7 years old, she was still untouched by the strange cloud that had settled over the family. Her world was still full of dolls and songs and sweetbread, crumbs. Joshua wished he could protect that innocence forever. Joshua. He turned. Rebecca stood a few feet away, nervously twisting her hands in her apron. She was only 2 years older than him, but her eyes had aged far beyond her years. "You look worried," he said. "I am." She glanced around, lowering her voice. "I need to speak to you about your father, about what he's doing with the children." Joshua's stomach clenched. "What do you mean?" "Last night," she whispered, "I couldn't sleep. I heard him talking to Brother Hartwell again. They were talking about preparations. Preparations for what?" Before she could answer, footsteps crunched against gravel. Thomas Hartwell rounded the corner of the barn, his mouth tight, eyes shadowed. He looked older than his 38 years, with weathered hands that never seemed to stop trembling anymore. "Brother Joshua." "Sister Rebecca," he said, voice clipped. "Brother Woolley asks to see you both, immediately." Rebecca's face turned white. "Both of us?" Thomas gave a curt nod. "He's waiting." As they walked toward the main house, Joshua noticed details he hadn't seen before. Thomas's jittery hands, the way he kept glancing at the horizon like he was hoping it might offer a way out. Whatever was happening, it was taking its toll. Inside, the study was dimly lit, the oil lamp casting gold and shadow across the room. Ezekiel sat behind the desk, a worn ledger open in front of him. The pages were neatly filled with names and dates in his precise, practiced hand. "Sit," he said without looking up. They obeyed, settling into the 2 chairs across from him. The silence stretched, long and sharp, before Ezekiel finally raised his eyes. They gleamed in the lamp's light, cold and unreadable. "The Lord has spoken with clarity," he began, voice steady, sermon-like. "The time for purification has come. The corruption of the world seeps even into our children. We must act now while their souls can still be saved." Joshua chose his words carefully. "What exactly does the purification involve?" Ezekiel's lips curled, but it wasn't a smile. "That's not for you to question, my son. Your role is to assist, to guide the younger children, to prepare them for their sacred responsibilities." Rebecca shifted. "Ezekiel, surely the children are too young." Silence. The command cracked through the room. She flinched and shrank back. "You forget your place, woman," he said coldly. "The Lord reveals his will to me, not to you." Joshua clenched his fists, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "With respect, Father," he said, "Rebecca is only expressing concern for the children." Ezekiel's eyes narrowed. "Do you question my authority, Joshua? Do you doubt the revelations I've been given?" The room fell into stillness again. The only sound was the tick of the mantel clock. Joshua knew he was walking a dangerous line, but Rebecca's trembling pushed him forward. "I question nothing," he said softly. "I only seek clarity so I can serve the Lord more fully." Ezekiel studied him for a moment, then flipped the ledger around so they could see. A list of names was scrawled down the center of the page. "These are the chosen," he said. Elizabeth, Catherine Hartwell, Samuel Morrison. And then Ezekiel's finger landed on a name that made Rebecca gasp. "Mary. Age 7, Mary?" She breathed. "She's just a baby." "She's old enough to be influenced by the world," Ezekiel said calmly. "The Lord has shown me that early purification ensures eternal purity." Joshua stared at the list, his sister's name blurring behind the heat in his eyes. "What does this purification require?" he asked. Ezekiel shut the ledger with a soft snap. "Sacred ordinances, physical and spiritual. You are not yet initiated. You don't need to understand the details." He stood. "The new moon is in 5 days. We begin then, when darkness falls and the veil between worlds is thinnest." As they stepped out into the hallway, Rebecca grabbed Joshua's arm. "We have to stop him," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "Whatever he's planning, it's not from God." "I know," Joshua said, "but we can't act too fast. If he suspects anything, She nodded quickly. "What about your mother? Would she help us? She's scared. He's worn her down." But maybe. Joshua paused. "The next supply run to Flagstaff is in 3 days. If I can get out unnoticed, I'll tell the authorities. And what will you say? That your father's planning a ritual? They'll laugh. Think we're just another backwoods sect fighting over doctrine." He hated how right she was. No lawman would ride 30 miles into the desert just because one young man was nervous about his father's sermons. That evening, Ezekiel led grace with the same thundering fervor. But Joshua saw it now, the hunger in his father's voice, the electric tension humming beneath the surface. It made his skin crawl. "Children," Ezekiel announced as they began to eat, "in 5 days we will hold a holy ceremony, a time of sacred purification. Those who have been chosen must begin fasting and prayer." Mary looked up from her plate, her eyes wide. "What kind of ceremony, Papa?" Ezekiel's voice was gentle. "A beautiful one, my dear. It will make you special in the eyes of God." Sarah's fork slipped, clattering against her plate. She started to speak. "There's nothing to discuss," Ezekiel cut in sharply. The Lord's will is clear. Later, Joshua found his mother alone in the kitchen, scrubbing the same plate over and over, her hands trembling. "Mother," he said quietly, "we need to talk." She glanced at the door, then gave a slight nod. Together, they stepped out, into the night air, the wind masking their voices. "You know what he's planning?" he said. Sarah's face cracked. Tears slid silently down her cheeks. "I've seen things. Heard things. He's not well, Joshua. He talks about the children like they're not even his. Then help us stop him." "How?" She whispered. "He's my husband. If I defy him ... and if we do nothing, Mary is on the list." Sarah choked on a sob. "What can we do?" She said. "The town is far. No one will believe us." "I have a plan," Joshua told her, "but it's risky. And it means some of us may have to leave everything behind." Sarah looked back at the windows of their home, where shadows flickered behind the glass. "Tell me what to do," she said. "Whatever it takes, I will not let him hurt my babies." And from the shadows of the porch, a pair of eyes watched them. Ezekiel had heard everything. His jaw clenched as he turned back into the house. The Lord's work, he thought, would not be stopped. Not by frightened women. Not by rebellious sons. Dawn broke heavy and gray, as if the sun itself was reluctant to rise over the Woolley compound. Clouds hung low, smearing the horizon with a dull haze. The air tasted like dust and worry. Joshua hadn't slept. He spent the night pacing in the barn, going over the plan again and again in his head. There were too many moving parts, too many places for things to go wrong. But the clock was ticking, and if they waited too long, the cost would be unbearable. Sarah moved through her morning chores like a woman haunted. She fried cornmeal cakes, ladled goat milk into bowls, washed laundry that barely needed washing anything to keep her hands busy. But her eyes kept drifting toward the main house, toward the room where Ezekiel kept his journal locked away, where her children were being called one by one for something he called spiritual preparation. Elizabeth helped her with the dishes, her shoulders tense beneath her apron. She leaned closer as she dried a tin cup. "Something's wrong," she whispered. "Father keeps staring at us. And last night, I heard him talking to Brother Hartwell again." Sarah nodded without looking up. "Stay close to me today, and keep Mary by your side." The supply wagon was scheduled to leave by midday, driven as usual by Brother Morrison. He was one of the few in the compound who hadn't yet fallen completely under Ezekiel's sway. Quiet, reserved, but not without a flicker of independent thought. If there was any chance of getting a message out, Joshua knew it depended on Morrison not asking too many questions and not getting caught. The plan was simple. As Morrison loaded up for the trip to Flagstaff, Joshua would slip into the back of the wagon, hidden beneath blankets and grain sacks. Once in town, he'd find the authorities' territorial marshals, church elders, anyone who might listen and explain what he feared was about to happen. But that morning, something felt off. Ezekiel stood on the porch, watching the yard with eyes sharp as broken glass. He called out in a voice that rang through the compound like a bell. "Joshua, come with me, son. There are preparations to be made in the barn." Joshua's stomach dropped. "Of course, Father." As they walked side by side, Joshua tried to steady his breath. He glanced at the wagon, saw Morrison tightening the last strap, felt his opportunity slipping through his fingers. At the barn, Ezekiel placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You've seemed troubled lately?" Joshua nodded slowly. "A lot is happening. I just want to understand how best to help." "Concern is natural," Ezekiel said. "But doubt, doubt is the serpent's whisper. It poisons the faithful." "I don't doubt the Lord," Joshua replied, "just my own understanding of his will." Ezekiel smiled thinly. "Good, because what's coming requires complete obedience." There's no room for hesitation. Inside the barn, several wooden crates had been arranged in a circle. Joshua felt his breath catch. Candles, robes, ropes. He didn't need to ask what they were for. Help me move these to the chapel, Ezekiel ordered. They'll be needed. Tomorrow night. They worked in silence, the weight of each crate growing heavier with every step. Joshua tried to stay calm, to gather whatever information he could. Will the entire community attend the ceremony? He asked, lifting a box with care. Only the faithful. The ones strong enough to witness God's work. The rest, Ezekiel's. Mouth twitched. Will remain behind. This is not a ritual for the weak-hearted. And the children? Joshua asked. Do they know what's going to happen? They'll understand when the time comes, Ezekiel said flatly. The Lord reveals his mysteries as the soul becomes ready. Back at the main house, Sarah was beginning to realize she was being watched. Martha, Ezekiel's youngest wife, had started shadowing her, always nearby, always listening. Her excuse was that she wanted to help with chores, but Sarah saw through the pretense. She saw the fear in the girl's eyes. Sister Sarah, Martha said softly as they folded laundry, side by side. Brother Woolley asked me to keep track of who you speak with today. He's worried about your spiritual condition. Sarah paused mid-fold. And what will you tell him? I haven't decided yet. Martha, Sarah said, lowering her voice. He's planning something terrible. You know it. I know. If we don't stop him, ... Martha's lip trembled. I heard him and Brother Hartwell last night. They were talking about ... obstacles, about removing anyone who interferes with the Lord's plan. They used that word removal like it was nothing. The words hit Sarah like a slap. Ezekiel wasn't just preparing to harm the children. He was prepared to silence anyone who stood in his way. And in his mind, that was God's work. Martha, please, Sarah whispered. We need to protect the children. I can't do it alone. Martha looked down at her hands. If I help you, and he finds out, I'll pay the price. I know, Sarah said gently. But if we don't do something now, we'll all pay a far greater one. Outside, the wagon began to roll away, a small cloud of dust trailing behind it. Joshua watched from the barn doorway, heart sinking. His one chance gone. Morrison gave a casual wave as he disappeared down the road, completely unaware of what had been at stake. Ezekiel's voice came from behind him, soft but firm. Disappointed, my son? Joshua turned slowly. I was hoping to send word to Cousin James in Salt Lake. It's been months since we've heard from that side of the family. Ezekiel's expression didn't change. Ah, yes. James, the one who chose apostasy over revelation. Perhaps it's best we keep our distance from those who've strayed. That evening, the rain came hard and fast. It pelted the roofs and windows, filled every crevice with the sound of nature's fury. But inside the Woolley home, something even darker was brewing. During supper, Ezekiel's voice rose above the storm. Lord, he intoned, we thank you for your guidance. We thank you for this time of preparation. Tomorrow, we fulfill your sacred will. We purify this house. We sanctify these souls. Mary looked up from her bowl. Her eyes were wide with curiosity. Papa, she asked, what does purify mean? Ezekiel smiled gently, but behind that smile lurked something cold and ancient. It means, he said, becoming clean and holy in the eyes of God. And my little lamb, tomorrow night, you will understand everything. Sarah gripped her spoon tighter. She wanted to scream, to stand up and shout and drag her children away. But she couldn't, not yet, not without a plan. After dinner, she found Elizabeth alone in the kitchen, wiping down the same counter for the third time. Elizabeth, Sarah said quietly, I need you to listen to me, carefully. The girl looked up. Her face was pale. "I'm scared, Mama. Father's been acting strange. And some of the girls, they've been crying after their meetings with him." "I know," Sarah said. "That's why tomorrow night, no matter what happens, you stay by me. Don't leave the room. Don't let anyone separate you from your sisters. Do you understand?" Elizabeth nodded slowly, her lips trembling. She was only 16, but she had seen enough to understand the danger, even if she didn't yet have the words for it. "I won't let anything happen to you," Sarah said, voice low and fierce. "To any of you. Not while I'm still breathing." And while the rain beat against the windows, while candles burned down to puddles of wax, the Woolley family braced for a night that none of them would ever forget. The storm passed in the night, leaving behind a brittle calm, the kind that felt like a hush before something breaks. Sunlight spilled over the desert in streaks of gold, but the Woolley compound remained steeped in tension. It was the day of the ceremony, and everyone knew it. Sarah barely touched her breakfast. Her hands trembled as she helped Mary with her shoes. Her thoughts ran wild, jumping from one terrifying possibility to the next. The image of that list in Ezekiel's ledger wouldn't leave her mind. Elizabeth, Catherine, Samuel... Mary, her little girl just 7 years old, too small to understand the evil masked as holiness. Elizabeth stayed close by, silent and watchful. Her face had hardened overnight. There was fear in her eyes, yes, but something else to resolve. Sarah had seen that same expression in her own mirror years ago, back when she first questioned whether the man she married was still the same one, who had once held her hand in a Utah chapel and whispered promises of faith and family. Mary twirled in her cotton dress, unaware of the storm still swirling around her. She clutched her doll in one hand and looked up at her mother with a smile that nearly undid Sarah. "I'm ready," she said. Sarah nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "You stay with me today, all right?" "Okay," Mary chirped. Outside, the compound buzzed with quiet motion. Ezekiel moved from building to building with the calm precision of a man setting pieces on a chessboard. He barely spoke, but his presence loomed like a shadow behind every door. Joshua had risen before dawn. He'd told his mother he was checking the livestock, but that wasn't the truth. In the far corner of the barn, hidden beneath a mound of burlap and hay, he'd found the thing he'd been hoping for and dreading. An old hunting rifle. His grandfather's, passed down through the family before Ezekiel had declared guns a temptation of the world. Sarah had hidden it years ago, refusing to throw it away, but never daring to use it. Now Joshua cradled it in his arms, running his fingers over the worn stock. He didn't want to use it. He didn't even want to touch it. But if tonight went wrong, he'd need more than faith. By midday, Ezekiel emerged from his study wearing a solemn expression. His journal remained locked in the desk drawer, but Joshua knew its contents by heart. He'd discovered a loose board in his bedroom wall weeks ago, just wide enough to glimpse into his father's study. Every night since, he'd watched Ezekiel scratch out the details of his so-called purification ritual. It wasn't a ceremony. It was a plan, a system, a justification for something far darker than Ezekiel would ever admit aloud. And tonight, it was going to happen. Joshua found Sarah outside the kitchen, staring at the chapel. "It's almost time," he said softly. Sarah nodded. "The robes, the candles, the ropes. They're already in place. We still have time." Joshua said, "But not much." "I'll keep the children close," Sarah replied. "We'll find an excuse to keep them out of the chapel. We need to be ready for anything." As if summoned by the tension in their voices, Martha appeared at the door, her eyes darting nervously between them. Her hair was disheveled, and her hands clutched the edge of her dress. "Sarah," she whispered, "we need to talk." She waited until they were alone in the pantry before she spoke. He asked me to help prepare the robes. For the girls. Sarah's blood ran cold. What did you say? I said yes, Martha admitted, because if I said no, he'd know I was on your side. But while I was in his study, I saw something. She pulled a crumpled page from her apron. It was torn. From Ezekiel's journal, the ink still smudged from where her fingers had gripped it. In panic, Sarah unfolded it and read in silence. Her hand went to her mouth. The words were simple, direct, depraved. The children are to be cleansed through sacred contact. Their resistance is natural, but the Lord demands obedience over innocence. Sarah folded the page slowly. Her voice came out like ice. Tonight, he dies. That evening, as dusk settled over the compound and shadows crept across the red earth, the Woolley family gathered for dinner. Ezekiel sat at the head of the table, calm and confident, his gaze drifting slowly from one face to the next. Children, he said as they ate, tonight we fulfill the Lord's command. Those who have been chosen will be honored with the sacred ordinances. You must fast, pray, and prepare yourselves in heart and body. Little Mary looked up from her plate. Papa, what does sacred ordinance mean? Ezekiel's eyes softened, but only on the surface. Joshua, watching from the other end of the table, saw something else behind them. Hunger, control. It means, Ezekiel said gently, that the Lord sees you, loves you, and has a special plan just for you. Sarah's fork clattered against her plate. Ezekiel, she started. There's nothing to discuss, he said sharply. The air in the room seemed to tighten. After dinner, Sarah found herself alone with Elizabeth again in the kitchen. They moved around each other in tense coordination, gathering dishes and wiping counters. When Elizabeth finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Mother, I heard what Father said to Mary, and earlier I saw Catherine crying outside. The chapel, something's happening, isn't it? Sarah didn't answer at first. Then, slowly, she turned toward her daughter. Tonight, she said, you stay close to me. You don't leave my side. And if anything feels wrong, you run. You hear me? You run and don't look back. Elizabeth's jaw trembled, but she nodded. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I, Sarah replied. But we don't have the luxury of fear anymore. As the evening deepened, a chapel was lit with candles. White robes hung along the zones, walls like ghostly figures. The ropes were laid out, coiled like waiting serpents. Ezekiel knelt alone before the pulpit, his hands folded, lips moving in silent prayer. But the God he prayed to was no longer the one Sarah once believed in. This was a God born of control, built from twisted scripture and isolation, shaped in the image of a man who had lost his way. From the barn, Joshua watched the flickering lights and the shifting shadows. The rifle rested beside him. He hated what it meant, hated what it might force him to become. But if that's what it took to stop Ezekiel, he would do it. Back in the house, Sarah gathered the children into the kitchen. I'm going to make a late meal, she said, so everyone stay close. No wandering. She set pots clanging, filled. The room with movement and noise. Anything to delay the moment Ezekiel would come calling. Elizabeth stood beside her, arms crossed, ready. Mary tugged at Sarah's dress. Mama, why are we all in here? Sarah knelt, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. Because we're going to stay together tonight, she said, no matter what. And just outside, on the steps of the chapel, Ezekiel stood, tall, arms raised toward the stars. The veil is thin, he murmured. The time has come. The clock struck 11:30, and the Woolley compound was wrapped in silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that feels like the world is holding its breath. The wind had stilled. The chapel candles flickered without challenge. their light painting. Long shadows across the walls. White ceremonial robes hung neatly like pale ghosts waiting to be worn. And from somewhere deeper, the floor creaked beneath footsteps that didn't yet know regret. Inside the kitchen, Sarah stood with her back to the doorway, stirring a pot of beans she had no intention of serving. Elizabeth dried the same plate. For the fourth time, the children sat close together at the long table, whispering softly, some clinging to their older siblings. Mary sat cross-legged on the bench, her doll perched on her lap, mimicking the mood around her without understanding its weight. Then the front door creaked open. Sarah didn't turn. She didn't need to. Ezekiel's footsteps were unmistakable, measured, deliberate, filled with the kind of certainty only dangerous men carry. He appeared in the kitchen like a shadow stretching into firelight. "It is time," he said calmly. His voice was soft, almost kind. But the stillness in the room shattered the illusion. The children stopped talking. Elizabeth froze in place, and Sarah's grip tightened around the wooden spoon until her knuckles went white. "The Lord's work cannot wait any longer," he said, stepping forward. Sarah turned slowly, planting herself between the children and the door. "They're not ready," she said. Ezekiel tilted his head. "Their souls are ready. Their bodies will follow. They're afraid, confused. A good shepherd doesn't lead lambs into fire." "A faithful shepherd," he replied, "leads them where the Lord commands, even into flame." Mary stood up, slipping quietly toward Sarah's side. "I don't want to go," she whispered. "Mama, I'm scared." Ezekiel knelt in front of her, his gray eyes softening. "Come here, my little lamb. Come put on your sacred robe." "No." The word came out of Sarah's mouth before she even realized it. Sharp, final. Everything in the room stopped. Ezekiel stood slowly. His face didn't change, but something in his eyes went dead. His voice dropped into something cold and brittle. "What did you say?" Sarah straightened, drawing herself up, even as her heart pounded in her chest. "I said no. I won't let you harm these children. Not in the name of God. Not in the name of anyone." He took a step toward her. "You forget yourself. I am the head of this house. I speak with divine authority." "No," she said. "You speak with madness. This isn't religion. It's sickness. And I won't be silent anymore." The slap came fast. Sarah didn't see it, just felt the sting, the explosion of pain, the sharp ring in her ear as she stumbled into the kitchen table. Elizabeth screamed and rushed to her side. The younger children cried out in fear. Ezekiel's voice boomed across the room. "Thomas, Brother Morrison, come collect the children. The ceremony begins now." A moment later, the two men stepped into the doorway. Their faces were pale, their eyes sunken. Thomas's hands shook as he stepped forward, reaching for his daughter, Catherine. But Catherine backed away, eyes wide with betrayal. "Please, Papa," she whispered. "Don't let him hurt me." Thomas hesitated. His face twisted as if something inside him was breaking. He looked at Ezekiel, then back at his daughter, caught between obedience and something older than faith-love. "Brother Woolley has received revelation," he mumbled. "It's the Lord's will, Catherine." "No," Elizabeth said sharply, stepping between the men and the children. "I won't let you take them." Ezekiel's eyes narrowed. "You dare defy the Lord's anointed?" He grabbed Elizabeth's arm hard enough to bruise, yanking her forward. "You'll come to the chapel willingly, or you'll be dragged." That's when the sound of boots echoed across the floorboards. Joshua appeared in the doorway, his grandfather's hunting rifle in his hands. "Let her go." Ezekiel didn't turn around. He didn't blink. His grip on Elizabeth remained tight, but his voice changed soft and coaxing. "My son, you don't understand what you're doing. This is the Lord's work. Would you raise your hand against a prophet of God?" I would raise my hand against any man who hurts children. You would commit patricide? I would stop a madman, Joshua said, even if he is my father. Ezekiel's lips twisted. He released Elizabeth and took a slow step toward his son. You don't see the big picture. These children, they've been corrupted by the world. I am saving them, purifying them. Joshua stood firm. You're destroying them. Suddenly, Rebecca burst into the kitchen. Her cheeks were wet with tears. Ezekiel, you have to stop this, she pleaded. Elizabeth locked herself in the root cellar. Catherine tried to run. Samuel's been vomiting for an hour. There, terrified. Ezekiel's face didn't move. The weak resist the Lord's will. That's why the strong must guide them, even against their own desires. Sarah clutched Mary tightly, feeling the child shake in her arms. She could hear Ezekiel's delusion twisting around every word. A man who believed so deeply in his role as prophet that he no longer saw the children as his own. They were vessels to him, flesh to be molded, not loved. Maybe we should postpone the ceremony, Sarah offered, trying once more to reach whatever sliver of reason might be left. Give them more time to prepare. No, Ezekiel said. The Lord has appointed this night. Anyone who interferes will be dealt with. The threat was clear. There would be no mercy. No more second chances. Sarah looked across the room. At Joshua, he gave her a tiny nod. They both knew. This wasn't going to end with negotiation. As the final moments of silence stretched between them. The candles in the chapel flickered wildly, casting tall, twitching shadows across the wall-like figures dancing before a funeral. Thomas and Brother Morrison stood motionless, their mouths slightly open, their eyes caught between horror and helplessness. Then Ezekiel turned and reached for Mary. That was the final straw. The moment his hand extended toward the little girl, Sarah stepped in front, shielding her daughter with her body. But she never had to take another step. Joshua raised the rifle. His voice was low, even. Don't. Ezekiel stopped just for a breath, and then he moved. He lunged toward his son with surprising speed. The rifle discharged with a deafening blast, and Ezekiel crumpled to the floor like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and quiet. The room went silent. Mary whimpered. Someone gasped. Sarah dropped to her knees beside the body, checking for breath, for anything. But it was over. Is he ... Elizabeth asked softly. Sarah looked up. Voice flat. He's dead. Joshua slowly lowered the rifle, his hands trembling. I had to, he whispered. He was going to. He was going to. I know, Sarah said. You saved us? Thomas dropped to his knees, burying his face in his hands. What have we done? What were we about to allow? Rebecca leaned against the wall, sobbing openly. Brother Morrison backed away slowly toward the door. Pale and shaking. Sarah stood, cradling Mary against her chest. The madness ends here, she said. We won't let it take another step. Outside, the wind returned, swirling dust through the chapel windows, scattering candlelight and whispers alike, the purification. Ceremony would never happen, but the night was far from over. The silence after the gunshot didn't feel like peace. It felt like the world had stopped breathing. The rifle still hung from Joshua's hands, the barrel still hot, the echo of that single thunderous moment still hanging in the kitchen air. Ezekiel Woolley lay on the floor, eyes open but empty. His body hadn't moved since the bullet tore through his chest. Sarah didn't cry. Not yet. She stood over her husband's body, heart pounding, one hand clinging to Mary's small frame, the other brushing hair from her own face, like it could wipe away what had just happened. There was no time for grief. Only the sharp, cold clarity of survival. Behind her, Elizabeth trembled, tears falling silently. The younger children huddled together in the corner, wide-eyed, too young to process what they'd seen, but not too young to feel its weight. Joshua stared down at what he had done. His breath came in shallow bursts, his mind spinning between guilt and necessity. He had known this day might come. He had prepared for it. But nothing could have prepared him for what it would feel like to shoot his own father. I had no choice, he whispered. Sarah turned to him, her voice steady. You made the right one. Across the room, Thomas Hartwell still knelt, frozen, eyes glassy with horror. He looked up at Sarah like a man waking from a terrible dream. We followed him, he said. We believed him. God help us, we were going to let it happen. Rebecca stood at the far wall, one hand pressed to her chest. He said it was holy. He said the Lord spoke to him. He lied, Sarah said softly. Or worse, he believed it. Brother Morrison stepped back into the hallway, his face ghost white. I need to go, he mumbled. I need to get home. My wife. She has to know. You can't leave, Joshua said. Not yet. If word doesn't reach the town the right way, we'll all be seen as part of it. Sarah nodded. We need to be careful. If we wait too long, they'll find us with a dead man, a community in chaos, and no explanation they're ready to believe. Elizabeth finally spoke. What do we tell them? Sarah glanced at the rifle, at the blood on the floor, at the broken faces around her. The truth. All of it. Joshua looked at her, uncertain. You really think they'll believe us? They'll have to, Sarah said, because I won't let this story be buried in shame. The storm outside had passed, but inside the Woolley home, the tension still roared. Sarah gathered the children in the main room, away from the body. She didn't want them near it. Not tonight. Maybe not ever again. She sat on the floor with Mary in her lap, whispering gentle words that barely held together. The girl was still, trembling, her small fingers clenched tight into her mother's dress. Are we safe now, Mama? Sarah kissed her head. Yes, sweetheart, you're safe. But even as she said it, she knew the danger hadn't disappeared. It had just shifted shape. In the chapel. Candles still burned down to stubs, their wax melting onto the floor in thick, pale pools. The white robes were untouched. The ropes lay still. The shadows that danced against the walls earlier now looked ashamed of themselves. By morning, Sarah had scrubbed every bloodstain from the kitchen floor, though the scent of death lingered in the walls. Joshua had wrapped Ezekiel's body in an old sheet and moved it to the back shed. There wasn't time yet to plan a burial. Not until someone knew what came next. 2 days passed. The compound felt suspended in limbo. No word came from outside. No one approached. The children whispered less. Some of them smiled again, but not often. They stayed close to Sarah, clinging to the sense of calm she projected, even when her heart felt like it was splintering. Joshua moved with quiet efficiency, fixing things, organizing what was left, keeping busy, like if he stood still, the guilt might catch up to him. He rarely spoke unless spoken to. Sarah knew that silence. She had lived inside it for years. Then, on the third morning, a cloud of dust rose from the far end of the trail. A wagon approached, flanked by 3 riders. The territorial marshal had arrived. Sarah stepped outside to meet them, her black mourning, dressed stark against the red Arizona clay. Her spine was straight, her jaw firm. Behind her, Elizabeth stood in the doorway, one hand on Mary's shoulder. Marshal William Hayes was a thick, weathered man with a face carved by years of sun and law. Beside him rode a younger man with sharp eyes and a notebook already in hand. Mrs. Woolley, Hayes said, tipping his hat. We received your message. I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am, but we need to investigate the circumstances of your husband's death. I understand, Marshal, Sarah replied. We've been expecting you. The younger man dismounted and looked around the compound with open skepticism. Agent Samuel Crawford, he introduced himself. Federal investigator. We've heard. Troubling reports. Disturbing, actually. Sarah didn't flinch. Then you've heard the truth. Agent Crawford raised a brow. You're admitting there was a plan to harm children? I'm admitting my husband had become dangerously delusional, she said, and my son stopped him before he carried out what he believed were divine orders. Marshal Hayes studied her for a long moment. Mind showing us to where it happened? Sarah led them to the study first. The journal lay open on the desk. She had arranged the pages, the diagrams, the lists all on it. She wanted no room for doubt. Hayes flipped through the pages, his expression growing more grim with each one. The young lambs must be prepared. Double quotes, he read aloud. Sacred physical ordinances, submission to divine authority. Good Lord. Agent Crawford stared at the diagrams. These look like restraints. They were, Sarah said. He called them sacred bonds. He said the children needed help overcoming their earthly resistance. And the white robes we found in the chapel? Ceremonial garments. The children were to wear them during the rituals. The words hit hard. Hayes closed the journal with a snap. I need to speak to your son. Joshua was in the barn, repairing a harness when they arrived. He stood as they entered, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. Joshua Woolley? Hayes asked. Yes, sir. The marshal's tone was firm, but not harsh. Tell us what happened. Joshua didn't hesitate. My father was planning to abuse children. When he tried to take my sister for what he called purification, I stopped him. Did you mean to kill him? Joshua took a long breath. I meant to protect my family. If that meant killing him, yes. I meant it. Crawford stepped forward. You could have wounded him. No, Joshua said. A wounded man like him, a believer like him, he'd never stop. He'd only become more dangerous. The barn went quiet. Hayes looked into Joshua's eyes, then nodded slowly. I believe you. 2 days after the marshal's visit, Cedar Ridge was no longer a forgotten speck on the Arizona map. Word had spread, first to the sheriff's office in Flagstaff, then to the papers in Phoenix. Soon, the name Ezekiel Woolley was printed in black. Ink across the front page of every territorial newspaper, each headline carrying its own version of horror. False prophet exposed in Arizona desert. Children rescued from cult's grasp. Purity ritual foiled by son's bullet. By the end of the week, the Woolley compound became a site of uneasy pilgrimage. Lawmen, reporters, and curious travelers arrived daily, some in boots and badges, others with notepads and wide eyes. But none could quite capture what had happened there. They saw the blood-stained chapel floor, the scattered robes, the journal filled with madness, but they didn't see the years of control, the slow erosion of thought, the way silence had once ruled louder than any sermon. Joshua stayed mostly in the barn. He didn't like the stares, the whispered speculation, the way people looked at him like a hero or a monster, unsure which he was. He didn't want praise. He didn't want pity. He just wanted the nightmares to stop. Sarah handled the questions. She answered each one with careful precision, never wavering. She gave them the truth, even when it made her voice crack. She refused to let them twist the story into a sideshow. My husband wasn't a madman from the beginning, she told one reporter. He was a man who lost himself, a man who confused power with holiness. And we, those of us who stayed, were too afraid to call it out. Agent Crawford returned 4 days after his first visit. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 federal lawyers accompanied him, along with a court clerk. They came to take formal statements, and perhaps to make an example of what had happened. He sat down with Sarah in the chapel, ironically, the very room where the rituals were meant to take place. Now, its walls echoed only with the creaking of wind through broken shutters. You understand, Crawford said, that this case will draw attention at the highest levels. Sarah nodded. "Then let them look." Crawford tapped his pen. "We've reviewed the journal, interviewed the children, and spoken with the community members. Some of them, including Thomas Hartwell, have admitted to complicity. If we charge them, it could mean years in prison." She glanced toward the window, where Catherine Hartwell and her brother Samuel were feeding the goats. "Just kids scarred, but healing. Were they monsters?" she asked softly. Crawford paused. "No, then don't treat them like they were. They were believers, blinded by fear, like I was once, like Rebecca, even Martha." Crawford studied her for a long moment. "So what do you propose?" "Put the blame where it belongs, on Ezekiel, and let the rest of us rebuild what he broke." Not all agreed. Some wanted punishment. Others demanded retribution. But Sarah's voice carried more weight than anyone expected. And when Joshua gave, his official testimony clear, firm, without apology, the marshal's office released their final decision. No charges would be filed against Sarah or her children. Those who confessed to lesser roles, Thomas, Rebecca, Morrison, would face probation, counseling, and public service. The government, it seemed, wanted closure as much as justice. But for Sarah, closure wouldn't come with the gavel's fall. At night, she still heard Ezekiel's voice whispering scripture into darkness. She saw him in dreams, standing at the pulpit, hands raised high, eyes ablaze. Sometimes she heard Mary crying in her sleep, and it broke something in her that might never fully heal. Still, life had to move, and so it did. The community didn't dissolve, but it transformed. Without Ezekiel's grip, people began making their own decisions again. Families returned to individual homes. The chapel was converted into a schoolhouse. The white robes were burned. The ropes buried. Sarah gathered the children each morning for reading lessons, using the Bible sparingly, and teaching them to question as much as to believe. "You can love God," she told them one morning, "and still say no when someone uses his name to justify evil." Elizabeth became her shadow, helping with chores, teaching the younger ones, and learning the rhythms of leadership with quiet strength. She rarely spoke of her father, but one evening as she helped Mary braid her hair, she said softly, "I don't think he knew how much damage he did." Mary, still small but sharper than most realized, replied, "Then he didn't deserve to lead." Joshua tried to stay busy repairing fences, tending livestock, building new storage sheds. He spoke little, but worked with a quiet fury, as though physical labor might chip away at what had settled inside him. One morning, Sarah found him sitting on the porch, rifle beside him, staring into the distance. "You don't have to punish yourself forever," she said. He didn't look at her. "I killed him. You saved us." He nodded slowly. "Still, there's a part of me that feels like I broke something that can't be fixed." Sarah sat beside him. "Maybe you did, but maybe some things needed breaking." The two sat in silence for a while, the desert stretching out before them. Vast and silent and waiting. Letters began arriving from Salt Lake elders, counselors, missionaries offering aid, support, apologies. Sarah answered some of them. Others she left unread. She wasn't ready to invite the church back into their lives, not yet. They had failed to notice the danger brewing in their own ranks. Forgiveness, she decided, would be earned, not offered blindly. One morning, Thomas Hartwell knocked on their door. His hat was in his hand, his eyes low. "I've been offered a chance to teach up north," he said. "Territorial school. I'd like to take my family with me. Start fresh." Sarah studied him. "Do you think you deserve that?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but my children do." She nodded. "Then go and do better." When they left a few days later, Catherine hugged Sarah tightly. "Thank you," the girl whispered, "for protecting us, for seeing what no one else dared to." Sarah smiled and brushed a lock of hair behind the girl's ear. Just promise me one thing. Anything. If you ever find yourself somewhere that feels wrong, if someone ever tells you to be silent in the name of faith, you speak. Louder. I will. And with that, another family left Cedar Ridge, carrying scars but also hope. Months passed by the time spring arrived. Wildflowers pushed through cracks in the dry earth. The air smelled different, cleaner, almost forgiving. The laughter of children returned to the compound. It wasn't the same place it once was. It never would be. But maybe that was the point. One evening, Sarah stood outside with Elizabeth, watching the sun dip below the hills. Do you think it's over? Elizabeth asked. Sarah thought for a long moment. No, she said. But we're not in danger. Anymore. Elizabeth nodded. I still think about him. So do I. Do you miss him? Sarah took a deep breath. I miss who he used to be, not who he became. Then they stood together, just mother and daughter, watching the sky turn. Gold. And for the first time in a long time, there was nothing to fear. The desert had a strange way of mourning, without sound, without spectacle. No black veils or processions. Just the wind brushing against the dry grass, and the sun rising like it always had. After the chaos, after the revelations, and after Ezekiel's death, life moved on. And yet, for Sarah, time had fractured. It now existed in two forms. Before and after. In the mornings, she swept the floor of the chapel turned schoolhouse. The wood boards worn from years of prayers, and now the scratching of pencil tips. Children sat at desks Joshua had built from salvaged pews. They recited arithmetic, read aloud, drew crooked letters across homemade paper. It wasn't much, but it was freedom. The kind of freedom Sarah herself had never tasted at their age. Mary sat near the front, her head bent over her notebook, her fingers curled around a blue crayon someone had mailed from Flagstaff. She was drawing a sun with eyes and a smile. A few months ago, she wouldn't have drawn anything but churches and robes. Now she sketched dreams. After class, the children scattered across the compound. Laughter returned to the air like a long-forgotten song, but the quiet moments still came. And in those moments, the ghosts crept back. Sarah stood alone in Ezekiel's old study one afternoon. The room had been cleared months ago, stripped of its doctrine and darkness. Yet the air still remembered him. Dust clung to the window panes. The chair where he used to write had a permanent dent in the cushion. Sarah stood behind his desk and ran her fingers along the grooves in the wood scars made by the pressure of his pen. She hadn't been in this room since the investigators had left. Now, as she pulled open the bottom drawer, she found it again, the last journal. Bound in worn leather, pages yellowed, corners fraying. The ink had faded, but not enough to forget. She flicked through it slowly. Verses mixed with madness. Prayers, scrawled alongside instructions for binding, purifying, breaking. Every sentence was a glimpse into the unraveling of a man, and then toward the final pages, something new. A letter, one he had never sent, addressed in trembling script to her. Sarah, I feel the walls closing in. I hear whispers even in silence. I see fire behind the eyes of our children. Perhaps I have gone too far, but the Lord keeps telling me to press on. He speaks to me in ways he never did before. Sometimes I wonder if it's truly him or something else entirely. If anything happens to me, if the burden becomes too great, you must lead. You always had the strength I lacked. I only ever wanted to be righteous. I didn't know righteousness could turn cruel. Ezekiel. Sarah closed the journal slowly, her fingers trembling. She hadn't cried when he died, hadn't screamed or collapsed or cursed the heavens. But now, sitting in his old chair, With the scent of old ink and desert air in her lungs, she wept not for the man who had become a tyrant, but for the man he used to be, the missionary, who once washed her feet after a long walk through the canyon, who sang softly to Elizabeth when she was colicky as a baby, who planted peach trees behind the chapel, convinced they'd one day bear fruit. That man had died long before the bullet, and in her heart she mourned him now. Later that evening, Sarah stood by the gravesite they had finally marked. It wasn't much, just a flat stone with Ezekiel's initials and the year etched by Joshua's steady hand. There was no scripture, no titles, no tribute. Just earth. She knelt beside it and placed the journal down, and stood again. I forgive you, she whispered, but I won't forget. The wind answered softly, rustling the sagebrush, then faded into stillness. Meanwhile, Joshua had taken to the northern ridge most mornings. It had become his refuge, a flat spot of land with a view of the horizon, where the land rolled in orange and violet waves. He would sit for hours with a worn notebook, sketching the mountains or writing lines he rarely showed anyone. One morning, Elizabeth found him there. She sat beside him without a word, her eyes tracing the same horizon he studied so often. You ever wonder what he saw when he looked out here? She asked. Joshua didn't look up. I think he saw what he wanted. To conquer, not understand. Elizabeth nodded slowly. And you? He paused. I see what I want to protect. She leaned her head on his shoulder. You've changed. He smiled faintly. So have you. That afternoon, the townsfolk gathered for something entirely new. A community dinner, hosted at the compound. Not for worship, not for ceremony. Just food, conversation, and healing. Sarah cooked stew while Martha baked bread and Rebecca passed out plates. Laughter bubbled around the tables. The children ran barefoot through the yard. People told stories, some true, some tall, and for the first time in years, no one invoked Ezekiel's name. Thomas returned briefly, this time just to visit. His daughter Catherine ran straight to Sarah and wrapped her arms around her waist, like a niece greeting an aunt. You were right, Thomas said quietly, his eyes filled with gratitude. Leaving saved us, but returning ... reminds us what we're saving ourselves from. You're welcome here, Sarah replied, so long as the past stays buried where it belongs. He nodded. It will. That evening, long after the dishes were washed and the guests had gone, Sarah sat on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand. Mary slept curled against her side. The stars blinked softly above. Coyotes howled somewhere far off, their calls haunting but somehow comforting. Elizabeth joined her with a blanket. You think this will last? Sarah thought for a moment before answering. No, nothing ever stays the same. But that's not always a bad thing. Elizabeth smiled. You sound like someone who's lived 3 lives. Sarah laughed softly. Sometimes I feel like I have. Then they sat in silence, watching the desert breathe. The wind carried no secrets, now only dust, memory, and the scent of new beginnings. Time doesn't ask permission before it moves on. It just drifts forward, inch by inch, until the dust has settled, the pain has dulled, and the stories once whispered become harder to hear. In the months that followed Ezekiel Woolley's death, life at the compound changed, not in dramatic waves, but in steady, quiet ripples. The routines came back, but they looked different now. There was no more forced scripture at dawn, no silence at meals, no sermons disguised as commands. The chapel's bell was melted down and turned into a wind chime that hung by the front porch, its tones soft and wandering. Never urgent. Children began to laugh again, not nervously or out of obligation, but freely, with the kind of joy that bubbles from a place deep inside. Mary, once afraid to sleep alone, now raced barefoot across the dusty yard, chasing lizards with the other children. She carried her doll less often and carried books more. Sarah still woke early. Some habits remained. But now, instead of kneeling on cold wooden floors in prayer, she stepped outside to watch the sunrise with a cup of tea in her hands. The sky no longer looked like something she had to answer to. It looked like something she belonged to. One morning, Elizabeth came to her with a question Sarah had been waiting to hear. "Do you think I should leave one day?" Sarah looked up from the laundry line, a clothespin between her fingers. "Leave? Not today, not even soon, but eventually, maybe to study, or to see more than this land." Sarah smiled, not with sadness, but with something close to pride. "I think you should go as far as your heart will take you," she said, "and then decide if you want to come back." Elizabeth looked toward the ridge where the desert met. "The sky. I think I will come back," she said. "But I need to leave first. I need to know who I am when I'm not his daughter." Sarah stepped closer and placed a hand on her daughter's cheek. "You're not just someone's daughter. You're your own story." That night, Sarah pulled out her old journal, one she hadn't touched since before the unraveling. Its leather cover was cracked, the pages yellowing at the corners. She began to write again, not to document survival, but to remember how they came through it, how they refused to let madness define them. She wrote about the girls who found their voices, the boys who cried and were comforted, the women who forgave themselves, and the men who stepped out of the shadows of complicity. She didn't shy away from the truth. She wrote about the fear, the rituals, the unspeakable plans. And she wrote about the day it ended, the shot that saved them, and the silence that followed. Every page was a stitch in a wound that still itched in the night. She kept the journal under her pillow. Not long after, Marshal Hayes returned, not with lawmen this time, but with a school inspector from Phoenix and a representative from the territorial governor's office. They had heard of Sarah Woolley, of her children, of the little desert school built from the bones of a chapel once meant for pain. The inspector shook her hand and walked through the schoolhouse. She asked the children to read aloud, watched them recite numbers and name stars from the astronomy. Map Elizabeth had drawn by hand. "They're bright," the inspector said. "They know more than most town children." Sarah nodded. "They've seen more, too." The inspector tilted her head. "Have you considered applying for a charter?" Sarah blinked. "A charter?" "To formally establish this place as a school recognized by the territory, with funding, materials, maybe even more teachers one day." Sarah didn't answer right away. She walked outside and looked at the dusty yard, at the old chapel door still hanging crooked on its hinges, at the children drawing pictures with chalk on the porch. Then she turned back and said, "Yes, I'd." Like that, it was slow work, the paperwork, the forms, the inspections. But it gave Sarah something she hadn't felt in a long time: momentum. Elizabeth helped with the letters. Joshua fixed the roof. Rebecca came back to assist with the little ones. Even Thomas sent supplies from his new teaching job in Prescott. They began calling the place New Light Schoolhouse, a name the children chose, because light came back. Mary explained. After all the dark, the name stuck. Still, healing was not linear. And some days were harder than others. Joshua, in particular, struggled with the silence inside him. He worked harder than anyone repairing fences, digging wells, raising goats. But there were nights he didn't come in until long after dark. Nights Sarah would find him sitting by Ezekiel's grave, staring at nothing. "I still don't know if it was right," he said to her one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. "You saved your sister," Sarah said. "You saved all love." "Yes, but I took his life." "You stopped what he had already killed in himself," she replied. He didn't speak after that. He just nodded slowly and stood. Sometimes that was enough. Later that summer, a letter came addressed to Sarah, written in elegant script on thick parchment dot. It was from Ezekiel's brother, Abraham. They hadn't spoken in more than a decade. I read what happened. I had no idea it had gone that far. Ezekiel and I, we parted ways for reasons not unlike what you faced. I don't write to excuse him, only to tell you that I believe you did what needed to be done. If ever you or your children find yourselves in Utah, my door is open. We may have failed to stop him, but we do not have to fail in the years ahead. Abraham Woolley. Sarah folded the letter and placed it in her journal. She didn't know if she'd ever write back, but it mattered. That someone from Ezekiel's bloodline had looked at the wreckage and said, "I see you." The next day, Sarah visited the cemetery behind the ridge. Not just Ezekiel's grave, but the little plot where others had been buried over the years, children who had died from illness, mothers who had given too much, fathers who had disappeared when the desert proved too vast. She walked through the yast. She walked through the crooked stones and weathered wood markers, reading names aloud like prayers. When she reached Ezekiel's grave, she stood in silence for a long time. Then softly she said, "You were wrong, but we're still here." She placed a single flower, dried, but still holding color, at the base of the stone. Then she walked back to the house, where Mary was drawing pictures, and the sun still hung warm over the red Arizona clay. The seasons rolled forward like a slow, dusty tide. The desert changed in quiet wayshade, creeping further across the schoolhouse walls. New cracks in the stone paths, birds building nests where chapel bells used to hang. What had once been? The Woolley compound was now a place of living, not surviving. And while scars remained, they no longer bled. Children planted a small garden on the eastern edge of the land cabbage. Squash, tomatoes that struggled in the heat, but refused to wither. Elizabeth taught them how to water just before sunrise, while the soil still held the night's coolness. They called it the Hope Patch, not because the plants thrived quickly, but because they grew at all. Some nights, Sarah sat by the window watching fireflies dance beyond the edge of the porch light. She still slept with the journal beneath her pillow, not because she needed it for protection anymore, but because it reminded her of where they'd been. How easily belief can be bent, how strong you have to be to straighten it again. That summer, a boy named Daniel arrived from Tucson. He was 12, quiet, with eyes that had seen more than a child should. His mother had passed the year before, and his father, one of Ezekiel's former followers, had vanished into the mountains. Word had reached Sarah through Abraham Woolley that the boy had nowhere to go. He came with nothing but a canvas satchel and a dog-eared book of Psalms dotted first. He barely spoke. He wouldn't eat with the others, wouldn't remove his shoes, even when he slept. But Sarah didn't push. She simply made space, gave him chores, let him find his rhythm dot. It took weeks, but eventually he started sitting with Mary during lessons, started brushing the goat's fur in long, meditative strokes. One afternoon, he quietly handed Sarah a small wooden carving, something he'd whittled from a fence post. It was crude, but unmistakable. A bird in flight? Freedom? She asked gently. He nodded. Sarah placed it on the mantel above the hearth. "You can stay as long as you need," she said. He didn't speak, but she saw it in his eyes. He was already choosing to stay. Joshua had started writing again. Not just notes or ledgers or supply lists, but real writing. Poems, reflections, stories, sometimes fiction, sometimes memories, sometimes pieces that lived somewhere in between. He kept them in a leather-bound book that he tucked behind the bedpost. Though Sarah suspected he wanted someone to find them one day. One evening, he brought the book outside, where Sarah sat under the stars. "I wrote something I think you should read," he said. Handing it to her. She turned to the first page. "There's a kind of love that doesn't feel soft. It feels like firewood in a storm." like a hand reaching through smoke. I didn't understand it until I stood between my father and my sister. I understand it now. She closed the book slowly. Do you still feel guilt? She asked him. He thought. For a moment. No, I feel grief. But it doesn't own me anymore. Sarah looked out at the yard, where laughter echoed faintly from the schoolhouse. You turned pain into something beautiful, she said. Joshua smiled. You taught me how. As autumn crept in, so did change. Elizabeth had made up her mind she would leave in the spring for a teacher's college in New Mexico. She'd earned a small scholarship through the Territorial Education Board. Her essays, especially the one titled Faith, Fire, and Forgiveness, had moved the committee to tears. The morning she told Sarah, she braced for sadness. But instead, Sarah just nodded, smiled, and handed her a folded handkerchief. I embroidered. This when you were a baby, she said. Kept meaning to give it to you when you turned 18. But 18 doesn't feel like the right milestone anymore. Elizabeth unfolded it. In the corner, stitched in tiny blue letters, were the words, Keep going. You are not alone. Tears filled her eyes. I won't go forever. You better not, Sarah replied, laughing gently. Someone needs to make sure this place doesn't fall apart. That evening, they sat together, just the two of them, and talked about everything that had been and everything that might be. Elizabeth hesitated before asking, Do you think you'll ever marry again? Sarah raised an eyebrow. Is that your way of telling me I look lonely? No, Elizabeth said, grinning. It's my way of saying you deserve more than just surviving. Sarah leaned back in her chair and looked up at the stars. I think I had love once, even if it ended badly. And now? Now I have purpose, peace, and coffee that doesn't taste like dirt. Elizabeth laughed. That's a start. The first frost arrived early that year. The leaves on the trees by the well turned yellow almost overnight, then brown. The children wrapped themselves in patched coats and drank warm goat's milk by the fire. Sarah stitched a new quilt, piecing together scraps from the old chapel curtains, the same ones that had once hung above the altar. They were faded now, soft with age. But when sewn together, it looked like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. On the final Sunday of the year, the whole community gathered again, this time not for prayer, but for remembrance. They built a small stone circle behind the schoolhouse, each family adding a rock for someone they'd lost, whether to death, to delusion, or to distance. No names, just the weight of memory, piled high like a cairn to guide future travelers. Sarah placed a single rock with her initials carved faintly into it. I lost myself, she whispered, but I found my way back. Mary stood beside her, holding her hand tightly. What happens to the people who never come back? The little girl asked. Sarah didn't answer right away. Then she said, We remember them, and we try not to follow. That night, the wind howled through the canyons, but inside the compound, the fire burned steady. There was no fear in it anymore, just warmth. Sarah fell asleep with the window cracked open, listening to the wind carry voices of the past across the desert. But this time, they didn't frighten her. They were only echoes, and she knew now they couldn't touch her anymore. Spring returned to the desert like a quiet apology, soft winds brushing away the memory of frost. Wildflowers blooming along the creek banks where children now waded barefoot. The land that once bore the weight of silence and submission now echoed with new sounds, laughter, questions, songs drifting from the schoolhouse, the thud of hammer against wood as new walls rose, stronger than before. The compound, now referred to by most as New Light, had taken on a life of its own. What began as a place of fear and control had become a symbol of resilience. People came not to worship a prophet, but to learn from survivors. They brought books instead of Bibles, paper and pencils instead of sacred cloth. And each time they arrived, Sarah welcomed them the same way, with open eyes, a strong handshake, and the quiet message, "You are safe here." The charter for the school was approved that month. A formal plaque was nailed beside the front door. Reading, New Light Schoolhouse. Founded 1894. In knowledge, we heal. In truth, we grow. Sarah ran her fingers over the engraved letters. They felt solid, real. Permanent dot inside the schoolhouse, the shelves were lined with donated books. Subjects ranged from history to astronomy to agriculture. A group of older boys had started studying animal husbandry. Mary had begun memorizing. Constellations. Daniel, the boy from Tucson, now read aloud to the younger ones with a voice so steady, it was hard to imagine he'd ever arrived silent. Elizabeth prepared for her departure with quiet excitement. Her bags were packed. Letters from the college had been folded and refolded. She carried a new notebook, wrapped in cloth and stitched with red thread. Inside it, she planned to write her own story, one that began not with a tragedy, but with survival. On her last night at New Light before the journey east, they gathered around the fire. There was no ceremony, no speeches, just warm bread, roasted meat, and the steady hum of familiar voices. Joshua played a tune on a handmade wooden flute, and Rebecca braided Elizabeth's hair while Mary sat beside her, clutching her hand like she was holding on to a lifeline. "You'll write to us," Mary said. "Every week," Elizabeth promised. "And come back as soon as the snow melts in the mountains." Sarah sat nearby, watching her daughter. She didn't cry. Not yet. But something inside her felt full, like a chapter was ending not in sorrow, but in strength. Later that night, as the fire burned low, Elizabeth found her mother alone at the edge of the ridge. The stars were bright above, the land below silent. "Afraid," she said softly. Sarah turned. "Of what?" "Of forgetting, of leaving this behind, of going out there and pretending none of it happened." Sarah reached over and took her hand. "You don't have to forget. You just don't have to be defined by it." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes shining. "Will they understand me? Out there?" "Some will. Some won't," Sarah said. "But you'll know who you are. And that's what matters." Elizabeth pressed her forehead to her mother's shoulder. "You gave me that," she whispered. "Just reminded you," Sarah said. "You already had it." At dawn, they said goodbye. Not at the gates of the compound, but at the creek crossing, where the wagon waited to take Elizabeth to the nearest rail line. Mary cried. Joshua hugged his sister so hard she lost her breath. Even Daniel offered her one of his whittled carvings, a small owl, eyes wide with wisdom. Sarah stood back until the very end, then stepped forward and placed something in Elizabeth's palm, a folded piece of paper. "Don't open it until you're alone," she said. Elizabeth nodded, climbed aboard, and waved until the wagon disappeared down the winding path. That night, in a small boarding room miles away, Elizabeth unfolded. The paper dotted read, "You are the ending I never thought I'd live to see. You are the reason the fire didn't consume us. You are proof that love can survive even the worst of men. Teach them to build with open hands. And when they ask where you come from, tell them you come from light." Back at the compound, Sarah sat alone in the chapel-turned-library. A fresh breeze moved through the open door. The air smelled of ink, old wood, and the faint sweetness of desert sage. She opened her journal, its final pages, blank, and began to write one last entry. "They will remember us, not as victims, not as the children of a madman, but as the people who took back the fire and lit a new way. We are no longer shadows in a doctrine. We are voices. We are choices. We are the ones who stayed and survived and rebuilt." Outside, the children were planting again. this time in neat rows, with seeds from Santa Fe and advice from an old farmer who'd offered to help. Rebecca read aloud from a book on soil and irrigation. Mary took notes on a slate tablet. Joshua, sleeves rolled, dug with his hands in the earth. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving. And from the ashes of control, something beautiful had taken root. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the land turned amber, Sarah stood beneath the wind chime. It rang softly in the warm breeze, like a memory asking to be remembered, but no longer begging to be heard. She smiled. For the first time in years, the silence inside her was not emptiness. It was peace.